Can a unique scent or drop of lotion actually change your attitude, let alone your status in the eyes of God? Did you know that the Hebrew word for cream and Messiah come from the same root? In this week's episode, we look at the anointing oil used to dedicate the tabernacle and sanctify the priests through the lens of daily skin care and self-care routines. The anointing oil was used not so much to soothe as it was to disrupt and redirect. In this segment, we focus on perhaps the most intriguing aspect of anointing, its role in triggering and marking significant transitions. We learned that kings from the house of David were anointed not because their succession to the throne was predestined or entitled, but precisely because David's choice as king was disruptive to the presumed line of succession. Hereditary kings from the kingdom of Israel did not require anointing. I encourage you to listen to the full episode for a deeper dive into this fascinating subject. So that concept that you only need the anointing oil when there's a disruption. You don't need the anointing oil when things follow in their pattern. I read that into that initial midrash that we started with. When God said to Moses, it's not only going to be your brother, but it's going to have to be using anointing oil. What I took that to be, and maybe it's a stretch, Rabbi, is what God was saying to Moses is, first of all, don't get all excited. This is a disruption. Your brother is not being chosen because his tribe is going to get a portion in the land or whatever. He's going to serve the other tribes. And there is a disruption here, and we're going to use the shemen. That was my read. But what I think what I take away from that, from the holy to the mundane, is that this idea of anointing is a way of changing oneself, is a way of, whether it's waking up in the morning and putting a smile on your face, but this idea of anointing was to trigger, was to make a change, a disruption. That was my read this year.
I think that's great. I mean, now the question is, why is anointing what makes that change? Right, that's the next question we have to look at. So that's for sure right. Anointing is a transitional moment, what you call making a change. Now we have to figure out, of all the things you could do, why is anointing the way in which we represent that transition?
Absolutely. And again, part of the question then becomes is, are we supposed to take notice of this? Is this something that is just extraordinary or routine? So the interesting thing is that the Talmud teaches that in that ark of the testimony that we've talked about in previous episodes, there was a tradition that there was sequestered in there a jar of the original manna, a flask of the anointing oil, and Aaron's staff with its almonds and blossoms. Rabbis, somehow our tradition took this anointing to be somehow magical, to have some potency to it. It wasn't just a routine. They didn't keep a part of the covenant. They didn't keep. This was extraordinary.
Yeah, I mean that right. So that right. So that's interesting. Okay, take it further. I'm not going to say anything. Take it further.
Yes. So then the question becomes, what is it actually made of? And in Exodus 30, it talks about myrrh and cinnamon, aromatic cane, cassia, olive oil. I quoted S.D. Lauder before. This was a real formula, Rabbi. There was a secret sauce here about how it was made. And it says, this shall be anointing oil sacred to me throughout the ages. It must not be rubbed on any person's body, and you must not make anything like it in the same proportions. It is sacred, to be held sacred by you. Any party who compounds its like or puts any of it on a lay person shall be cut off from the kin. So it really was considered a secret sauce, We're going to go to our buddy Casuto. I said earlier that we are finishing a book today of Exodus. Unfortunately, we're also finishing Casuto's commentary on the
Right,
Bible.
that's
He
it.
oh, he
Okay.
only did
He has the
Bereshit.
he uses he commentary comments on the best two books of the Torah.
He did Bereshit and Shemot. So, true to form, he says, this paragraph dealing with the anointing oil was placed here possibly on account of the connection between washing, anointing. He says, anointing with oil for the purpose of consecration was likewise customary among the neighboring peoples. And since the practice is in no way contrary to Israel's faith, it continued also among the Israelites. In accordance with this custom, instructions are given to Moses to prepare oil for anointing. So the first thing he says, true to form, if you recall, he talked about different types of mitzvot. When we talk about a code of Jewish law, there's plenty of things that we accepted from the general ambiance, from other cultures. This was one of them. Here is a picture of an Egyptian anointing. You can see on both sides they are pouring oil onto the head of the king. And then he goes on to say, there are those commentaries who have found it difficult to understand why the quantity of the oil is so small. I mentioned all the other ingredients. The other ingredients are much larger than the oil. And what he comes out to say was there was a whole process that these other herbs and spices were spent through, but ultimately this wasn't really an oil. It was more of a paste or a cream, Rabbi. So that's the first thing that he says. And of course, he does talk about Akkadian documents that talk about something along those lines. It wasn't only an oil in terms of its texture, it also had a very distinct smell to it. And then he gets into, so how was it put on all of these objects and all of these people? What he says was it was almost like a branding mark. It was not poured. There, because it was a paste, you would see on a piece of fabric that was used in the temple a little dot. And you would know, therefore, that not only was this consecrated, but that it was unique. And that's what I made reference to in terms of branding. This was tagging objects to make sure that this would last. It was a permanent substrate, and it was a way of tagging things to make sure that they were understood to be holy. So I found that very fascinating, and I think that the lessons that we need to learn from this is to open up our eyes and minds, number one, as you were saying before, to the daily routines of another generation. But we're about to do the Passover Seder, where we do things like dipping and washing and leaning. And I think it's a good time to focus a little bit on this whole element of anointing. What are your takeaways from our discussion today?